He's lying on a bed in Hong Kong, 32 years old, and he will never wake up again. The man who could kick faster than a camera could capture, who punched with more force than most men could generate with a swinging axe, who built an empire out of nothing but bruises and belief, is gone. Just like that. No warning. No final fight scene. The most alive human being millions of people had ever watched on a screen simply stopped. And here's the thing that still gives people chills 50 years later. The world hadn't even seen his masterpiece yet. Enter the Dragon hadn't premiered. He never got to watch himself become a legend. This is the story of how a sickly kid who almost died as a baby, who got beaten up on the streets of Hong Kong, who was told by Hollywood executives that he wasn't right for the leading role, became the most famous martial artist who ever lived. A man whose name, decades after his death, still makes people stop scrolling. This is the story of Bruce Lee. Let's go back. San Francisco, California, November 27, 1940. In the Chinese hospital, in the year of the dragon, in the hour of the dragon, a boy is born to a touring Cantonese opera performer named Li Hoi Chuen and his wife Grace Ho. They name him Li Jun Fan. But the hospital staff, following American custom, also give him an English name, Bruce. Nobody in that delivery room could have imagined what that name would come to mean. The family returns to Hong Kong when Bruce is just a few months old, into a city still recovering from war, still crowded, still hard. And right from the start, life tests him. As an infant, Bruce is sickly, so sickly that, according to Chinese tradition, his parents pierce his ear and give him a girl's name for a time, a superstition believed to trick evil spirits into leaving a fragile child alone. They were afraid he wouldn't make it. He made it. But childhood in post-war Hong Kong was not soft. It was streets full of gangs, refugees, poverty, and boys who had to prove themselves with their fists just to walk home safely. Bruce Lee, yes, the same Bruce Lee who would one day be called the fastest man alive, grew up getting into street fights, real ones, bloody ones. He wasn't a prodigy who floated above the chaos. He was a kid who got hurt, who lost fights, who had to learn. By the time he was a teenager, Bruce was already something of a local troublemaker, energetic, cocky, restless, constantly getting into scraps in the alleyways of Kowloon. His parents, worried he was heading toward real danger, made a decision that would quietly change martial arts history forever. They enrolled him to learn Wing Chun Kung Fu under a master named Ip Man. Picture that scene for a second. A skinny teenage boy, one of dozens of students crowding into a small room, learning under a master who trained legends. Bruce wasn't the best student in that room. He wasn't the prodigy everyone remembers him as. He struggled, he fought, he got frustrated. But he had something most of the other students didn't have, an obsession. He didn't just want to learn Kung Fu. He wanted to understand it, take it apart, question it, rebuild it. While he trained in Wing Chun, Bruce also had another outlet for his restless energy, dancing. Specifically, the cha-cha. And here's a detail almost nobody expects. Bruce Lee, the deadliest man in cinema, was actually a cha-cha champion in Hong Kong as a teenager. He even taught dance lessons on a cruise ship to earn extra money. The same explosive footwork, the same rhythm and control that would later make his fight scenes look like violent ballet. Some of that came from a dance floor, not a dojo. But street fighting kept catching up to him. At 18, Bruce got into a serious altercation with the son of a triad family. The fight was bad enough that his parents feared real consequences, police trouble, gang retaliation, maybe worse. So they made a hard decision. They sent their son away, alone, across an ocean, back to the country where he was born but had never really lived in, the United States. Imagine being 18 years old, put on a boat with almost no money, sent to a country you don't really know, to start completely over. That's exactly what happened to Bruce Lee in 1959. He landed in San Francisco, then eventually made his way to Seattle, where he worked at a relative's restaurant, washing dishes and waiting tables just to survive. This is a version of Bruce Lee most documentaries skip past too quickly. Not the icon, not the myth, but a broke immigrant teenager scraping together tips in the back of a Chinese restaurant, unsure of what his future held. But Bruce wasn't the type to just survive. He enrolled at Edison Technical School to finish his diploma and eventually attended the University of Washington, where he studied philosophy. And this detail matters more than people realize, because the philosophy Bruce absorbed there, blending Eastern thought with Western pragmatism, would eventually become the intellectual backbone of everything he created. He wasn't just a fighter, he was a thinker who happened to fight. It was in Seattle that Bruce started teaching Kung Fu, informally to friends, and soon, paying students. This was radical. At the time, many traditional Chinese martial arts masters refused to teach non-Chinese students. Bruce didn't care about those boundaries. He taught anyone who was serious, regardless of race or background. It caused controversy in the traditional martial arts community. Some saw him as disrespecting tradition. But Bruce believed martial arts belonged to whoever was willing to work for it. It was also in this period that Bruce met a young university student named Linda Emery. She wasn't impressed by tough guy posturing. She was drawn to his intensity, his intelligence, the way he talked about ideas most people never thought about. They fell in love, and in 1964, they married, an interracial marriage that, in that era, still raised eyebrows in parts of America. They would go on to have 2 children, Brandon and Shannon. Bruce's growing reputation as a martial artist eventually led him to a moment that changed everything. A demonstration at the 1964 Long Beach International Karate Championships. He moved differently than anyone else on that floor. Fast, efficient, almost impossibly precise. In the crowd that day was a Hollywood hairstylist who happened to know television producers. That chance connection led to an audition, and Bruce Lee was cast as Kato in the TV series The Green Hornet. For a moment, it looked like Bruce's American dream was taking off. The show gave him national exposure, but The Green Hornet was canceled after just 1 season. And what followed was one of the most painful stretches of Bruce Lee's life, the stretch almost nobody talks about. Hollywood, in the late 1960s, simply wasn't ready for an Asian leading man. Bruce pitched a television concept about a Shaolin monk wandering the American West, an idea he had developed and pushed hard for. Studio executives loved the concept, but told him, essentially, that American audiences would not accept an Asian actor in the starring role. The show was eventually made as Kung Fu, starring a white actor, David Carradine, in yellow-face makeup. Think about that. The man who arguably built the concept, whose entire life's philosophy was baked into that idea, was pushed aside because of the color of his skin. That kind of rejection could break a person. Instead, it lit a fire in Bruce that would never go out. Rather than wait for Hollywood to accept him, Bruce turned to teaching and refining his own martial philosophy. He had grown frustrated with the rigid, traditional structure of classical kung fu styles. Styles that, in his view, taught fixed patterns instead of real, adaptable combat. So he broke away and created something entirely his own. Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. It wasn't a style in the traditional sense. It was a philosophy of no limitation. Take what works, discard what doesn't, adapt like water. That phrase, be like water, wasn't just a marketing slogan. It came from Bruce's actual worldview, born out of years of being boxed in, rejected, underestimated, and forced to adapt just to survive. While building his own martial arts academies in the U.S., training students that would later include Hollywood stars and basketball legends, Bruce kept knocking on Hollywood's door. Small roles, fight choreography work, little cracks of opportunity. And then, in a twist nobody saw coming, it was Hong Kong, the place he'd been sent away from as a troubled teenager, that gave him his real shot. Bruce returned to Hong Kong and starred in The Big Boss in 1971. It was a modest production by Hollywood standards. It became a sensation. Then came Fist of Fury in 1972, even bigger. Then Way of the Dragon, which Bruce didn't just star in, but wrote and directed himself, featuring a legendary showdown with a young American karate champion named Chuck Norris, filmed inside the Colosseum in Rome. Overnight, Bruce Lee wasn't just an actor. He was the biggest movie star in Asia. And Hollywood, the same industry that had rejected him just a few years earlier, suddenly wanted him badly. A joint American-Hong Kong production was arranged. Enter the Dragon. It would be the film that finally, fully introduced Bruce Lee to the entire Western world. Bigger budget, international cast, a real shot at global stardom. But behind the scenes, while filming wrapped, Bruce's body was under enormous strain. He trained obsessively, sometimes to extremes that worried even those close to him. He pushed his physical limits constantly, believing discipline had no ceiling. Then, on July 20th, 1973, just weeks before Enter the Dragon was set to premiere and change his life forever, Bruce Lee collapsed at the Hong Kong apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei, complaining of a headache. He was given a prescription painkiller. He lay down to rest. He never woke up. He was pronounced dead at just 32 years old. The official cause was cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, believed to have been triggered by a severe reaction to the medication he'd taken. The sudden death of a man who seemed physically invincible sent shockwaves around the world. Conspiracy theories exploded almost instantly. Poisoning, a supposed ancient curse on his family, even claims tied to organized crime. None of these theories have ever been substantiated by evidence. The most credible medical explanation remains what doctors determined at the time: a rare, fatal reaction that struck down a man whose body had otherwise seemed unbreakable. Weeks later, Enter the Dragon premiered in theaters. Bruce Lee, the man who lived it, sweated for it, fought for a decade to make it happen, never saw it. It became a massive global hit. It made him immortal, and he wasn't alive to witness a single frame of his own triumph. If that isn't already one of the most heartbreaking twists in entertainment history, tragedy struck the Lee family again, 20 years later. In 1993, Bruce's son, Brandon Lee, who had followed his father into acting, was killed in a horrifying on-set accident while filming The Crow. A prop gun, improperly loaded with a live round lodged in the barrel from an earlier scene, fired and struck him. He was just 28 years old. 2 generations, 2 devastating premature deaths. It's the kind of story that feels almost too painful, too cinematic to be real. And yet it is. But here's what actually defines the Bruce Lee legacy. Not the tragedy, but what came before it, and everything that came after. Bruce Lee broke barriers that had nothing to do with martial arts. He was one of the first Asian actors to become a genuine global leading man in an industry that had spent decades reducing Asian characters to stereotypes or comic relief. He refused to play into those stereotypes. He demanded dignity, strength, and complexity in every role he fought for. He revolutionized martial arts training itself, blending Eastern philosophy with Western strength and conditioning science, decades before cross-training became a buzzword in professional sports. Many of the training principles athletes use today, functional strength, adaptability over rigid systems, mental discipline paired with physical conditioning, trace directly back to concepts Bruce pioneered. He also quietly broke down doors in the martial arts community itself, by teaching students of every background, insisting that discipline and respect mattered more than heritage. And his philosophy, captured in his own writings, published posthumously in works like Tao of Jeet Kune Do, continues to influence not just fighters, but entrepreneurs, athletes, and everyday people chasing self-mastery, decades after his death. Today, Bruce Lee's name is instantly recognized on nearly every continent. Statues of him stand in Hong Kong and in Mostar, Bosnia, a city that erected his statue as a symbol of unity across ethnic divisions. His hometown honors him. His films are still studied by directors and choreographers. Actors, fighters, and filmmakers, from Jackie Chan to Kobe Bryant to modern MMA champions, have cited him as a foundational influence. He lived only 32 years. He starred in a small handful of films, and yet his impact on martial arts, cinema, philosophy, and cultural representation is still being felt, generation after generation. Because Bruce Lee's real story was never really about kicks and punches. It was about a sick, small immigrant kid who got knocked down by street fights, by rejection, by an industry that told him he didn't belong, and who kept adapting, kept flowing, kept becoming. Be like water, he said. Water doesn't fight the obstacle. It moves around it, through it, past it, and eventually, it wears the obstacle down completely. Bruce Lee didn't just say that. He lived it. all the way to the very end. And maybe that's why, more than 50 years after his death, we're still watching, still learning, still inspired by a man who never got to see his own greatest triumph, but gave the rest of us everything we needed to find ours. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold true stories of the icons who changed history, and drop a comment below telling us which part of Bruce Lee's journey hit you the hardest. Because legends like this deserve to be remembered, not just for how they died, but for everything they fought for while they were alive.